Hi, I'm Freddie Spencer, three-time world champion motorcycle racer. I've won two 500 championships, which today would be MotoGP, and one 250, which would be today be Moto2. The uniqueness about my championships, the 250 and the 500, was in the same season in 1985. My first British Grand Prix was in the summer of 1981. It was actually my first Grand Prix race with Honda. There was no HRC at the time. I was contracted with American Honda for beginning 1980. But I'd raced the bike at the time that Honda was trying to compete in the World Championships, was called the NR 500. It was an oval piston four-stroke that they had decided they wanted to build in the late 70s, compete head-to-head with the two-strokes which were emerging. And I had raced at Laguna Seca in July of that year, and I'd won a heat race. I beat Kenny Roberts in a 5-lap heat race. He was world champion at the time. After that heat race win, you would have thought I won the world championship, because the bike had not been competitive in the Grand Prix, never won a race. But the next day in the main event, it was the AMA Championship Series, the bike broke, didn't finish, but they got the bright idea and they thought it'd be great. They said, would you mind racing in the British Grand Prix, which was 2 weeks later, and that's how I ended up in my first British Grand Prix. My first memory would be vivid memory, was sitting on my sofa in August of 1979, and I was reading the cycle news. I was racing in the AMA Championship at the time. Kenny Roberts, of course, was already world champion. But I started paying attention to it because I felt one day I was going to race in the World Championships. And so I'm sitting on my sofa, and the broadcast came on. It was a network, ABC Wide World of Sports. And that was the only race that I think they were telecasting that year that I could see in the United States. And I was sitting there, and I look up, and this video came on, and it was of Honda competing in their first Grand Prix as a factory since 1967, 12 years. And they showed a gentleman standing there, and it was Mr. Honda. Next to him was Mr. Majiri. I didn't know it at the time. I recognized Mr. Honda. But anyway, it was a disaster. Mick Grant and Takazumi Katayama only got into the actual Grand Prix because it was a promoter's option. They weren't even fast enough to qualify. The bike was really not that good. And they didn't even finish one lap. Both of them crashed. Oil leak, turn one, bike caught on fire. It was a really disaster. But it's a vivid memory for a couple of reasons. One is I knew right there and someday I was going to ride for Honda. I could just feel it, you know. And the other thing is what a great last lap that was with Kenny Roberts and Barry Sheen. And in fact, that lap time on the last lap stood for a long time, 1:29. It took 4 years to break that record. So. Certainly would have to be the 1985 race-wise, because that Grand Prix in '85 was kind of the point where I wrapped up the 250 championship by finishing fourth. The conditions were horrible. In fact, without question, my 29 years of racing, it was the worst conditions I'd ever raced in. The wind was blowing so hard and the rain was coming down so hard that coming on the hanger straight, it literally was coming in sideways and inside my helmet. I would have to tilt my head to the right to keep it from coming in. But I got through the 250 race, and what a contrast the two races were. I barely survived the 250 race, If Alan Carter, unfortunately for him, I felt bad for Alan, he crashed on the last lap, which allowed me to get fourth, and I wrapped up 250. The 500 race, because of what happened in 250, I just took off and was able to win it, which allowed me to go to Sweden the next week and wrap up the 500, so that was it. But the actual personal side, my favorite memory, was the Friday afternoon practice in 1983, and this is why. Is I was sitting there and I'd been leading the 500 championship for most of the year. Kenny Roberts had closed down to within now 5 points, had a 25-point lead. I'm hanging on by my fingertips with my 3-cylinder that day, barely. I couldn't even get within a second of Kenny on the V4. And so it's about 7-8 minutes to go in Friday afternoon, the last practice, and I'm sitting in my garage and I'm sitting there and I'm dejected, I'm exhausted. It's 7 months into the season. And I feel these hands come up and put up their hands on my shoulders. And I look up and the gentleman's looking at me and he goes, "Freddie, do you know who I am?" I go, "Of course I do, Mr. Surtees." And he goes, "Call me John." He said, "I know how hard you're riding the bike." He said, "You can do it. I know you can do it. You know you can do it. Keep doing it. It'll be just fine." And he winked at me and he walked away. And that moment for me was inspirational, you know, and that's why I'm gonna miss John, you know. But that moment he gave me years later doesn't surprise me at all. We became good friends, but it was priceless and is exactly what I needed. Well, for different reasons, and hopefully everybody will not get too upset. I like people for different reasons. You know, I mean, I like Marc Marquez, he broke my record 3 years in 13. And I remember I was sitting in Imola with Phil Reed. Phil Reed and I are watching it late at night. It's 9 o'clock on a Sunday night, and we're watching the Texas race. And so Marc won that day. This was April 22nd of 13. And so he asked me, "Does it bother you?" I go, "No." I said, "He'll go on and win the world championship." I said, "All records are made to be broken." I'm very fortunate. I was the youngest world champion at the time, youngest race winner at the time. But I said, when someone comes along that contributes and raises the level, which is what Marc did, his ability to work around issues, you know, what he could do with the motorcycle, which I appreciate in watching him do it. It inspired even Jorge and certainly even Valentino, you know, to push a little bit and raise their level. And so in that respect, I respect Marc for that a lot. Valentino, what can you say? I respect him 20 years. It's not easy to do it at this level. And his ability to adjust and adapt to the bikes today. I mean, he comes from 500 racing like me. But I see in him what I've always respected in Graciano, his dad, who accepted me when I came over, just a maverick and just loved to ride. And Graciano was like that, and you see that in Valentino. So it's great to see that in his contribution to racing. Well, I think all the fans would love to see Valentino in it, and especially if he's leading, by the time they get here, if he's still leading the world championship. You know, what he's done in these first 3 races, I think is a little bit what he learned in the 15. Just even when him and Maverick, you know, they had a little thing on Saturday, he just ignored it. Zarco thing, move on. Don't let any of that stuff bother you. And he's gotten, what, 2 seconds and a third, and who knows, you know, it'd be great I think for him, for the sport, if he's leading the championship come July. I think also everybody is waiting for that battle between Marc and Maverick. Because I think if they ever get themselves battling, they'll push, I think, everything to another level. And which the sport also is good for the sport. New young guys coming in and a good battle between them. Is we're all in this together. And motorcycling, it gives all of us so much. It is things that we share through inspiration. You know, one of the privileges for me is, you know, I've been doing this 51 years, is young and old, is when they say, Freddie, you know, I remember watching you at the French Grand Prix and my son, who has a son now, and so thank you for that. Or I got into motorcycles because watching you. What I say to them is what you've given me and what you give all of us here, all of us racers, is the privilege and opportunity to do this and be inspirational. But I think it's not about ability, it's not about that. Young and old, rich and poor, motorcycling is a passion-driven sport, and it's something we should embrace and be thankful for.